these next couple of slides just show some key segregation of duties that occur in the purchasing process that are important. And what I would say for these is, again, I don't want to read them all out to you one by one. I do think they all make a lot of sense. They all follow our basic rule that we talked about, which is custody, authorization, and reporting should be kept separate. So if you just looking at this one, disbursement, which is kind of this idea of custody, should be kept separate from AP, which is recording activities. So if you just read through all of these individually, definitely do take a read through to make sure they all make sense to you, but they should all follow our basic rule that we talked about. And same thing with this one, right? Purchasing is this authorization, receiving custody, AP department is more about recording, cashier is about custody, IT department. People ask me this sometimes. The IT department is typically about authorization because they're going behind the scenes and giving people approvals and authorizations to their accounts. So they are giving that person authorization and access to update the AP records. So IT is really more of an authorization function when we talk about it this way. So inherent risks in the AP process. Okay, so these two, again, are really interrelated. So we have, is the supply of raw materials adequate? And how volatile are raw material prices? So an example I typically like to use a lot here is oil. Oil usually is something we think of as having relatively low supply, and so demand is high and it can move prices around a lot. But let's talk about how that can kind of translate into misstatement risk. So this is a chart of historical copper prices. And the reason why I included this is one of my audit clients in particular, copper was both their main raw material input and it was their main finished good kind of output. So in terms of what was in their finished goods, copper was basically 99% of it. So it drove the price of the finished good, right? And obviously it was their main raw material too. So copper drove the pricing of everything. It drove the price of their sales. It drove their cost of sales. It drove their inventory pricing. So what happened when I was on the audit was, if you look here in January of 2009, you see this huge dip in copper prices where they had been, I guess you could say, relatively steady, somewhere between $2.50 and $4 a pound in the last, 5 years. And then all of a sudden they go down to below $1.50 a pound, which really hadn't been seen since 2004. So what happened because of this was, if you look in the year 2009, all their sales were made basically at the market price of copper. So their sales were made at these prices. So their sales were at lower prices. Yes. And their COGS was, for the most part, what was sitting in inventory was at these relatively much higher prices. So what wound up happening in fiscal year 2009 was their actual net income was almost zero. So they basically sold the same in volume, right? So in terms of pounds, copper pounds sold, it was the same as 2008, but sales was at lower price, COGS was at higher price. And so when we come down to net income, it's basically close to zero. And so what wound up happening was all these valuations were completely bizarre. Like the valuation of COGS became really difficult. The valuation of inventory became really difficult because they were on a LIFO system. And so the estimate of this and the estimate of this was all very difficult. And then the same thing, so this was fiscal year 2009, and the same issue happened in fiscal year 2010 because all their inventory in 2010 was at incredibly low prices, and their sales prices in 2010 were at these comparatively astronomically high prices. So they basically had all these gains in 2010 that weren't due to actual sales, but they were due to, inventory costing. So these can cause, obviously, these things can cause a lot of inherent risk of misstatement because it's basically due to valuation, right? Making sure things are valued appropriately and things like that. It's basically due to accounting, not due to the actual underlying economics. So much of what is happening, I mean, to some extent it's underlying economics because it's what's going on with pricing, but it's not underlying economics in terms of how much they're actually selling, because in terms of actual sales in 08, 09, and 2010, they were actually very, very even. They pretty much sold the same amount of product each of those years. So yeah, it's very interesting what happens with pricing. Another thing to, of course, always consider an inherent risk, and we always say this, is whether or not there were misstatements in that area in prior audits. So if there have been, you tend to have higher inherent risk.